The sun had barely climbed over the distant hills when David Gower stepped out of his small wooden house. Cold morning air bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. His boots sank into the dusty ground as he walked toward the barn, carrying a bucket of feed. This was his daily routine, quiet, lonely, and predictable. Out here, silence was his only companion. That morning, something felt different. An uneasy feeling twisted in his chest, as if the day was about to change his life forever. After finishing his chores, David Gower climbed into his old pickup truck and drove toward the edge of town. A faded sign appeared ahead, Silver Creek Horse Rescue. The place looked forgotten, just like the animals inside. Rusted gates creaked as he pushed them open. Inside, several horses stood in worn-out stalls. Some lifted their heads with hope, others barely moved. Then David Gower saw him. A dark brown horse stood alone in the far corner. His ribs showed through his skin. Old scars covered his legs. One eye was cloudy, and his body trembled slightly, as if he expected pain at any moment. "That's Shadow," a worker said quietly behind him. "Don't waste your time. He's broken. Everyone says he'll fail." David Gower stepped closer. Shadow didn't run. He just stared, breathing slowly, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut straight through David Gower's heart. "What happened to him?" David Gower asked. "Raced too hard. Fell badly. Owners dumped him when he couldn't win anymore," the worker replied. "No one wants him. He's dangerous. Unstable." David Gower reached out slowly. Shadow flinched, then froze. After a long pause, he allowed David Gower's hand to touch his neck. In that moment, something powerful passed between them. David Gower felt it deep in his bones. This horse wasn't a failure. He was a survivor. "I'll take him," David Gower said firmly. The worker's eyes widened. "You're making a mistake." People nearby laughed. "That horse will never run again." David Gower turned back to Shadow and whispered, "Everyone says you'll fail, but I don't." Shadow lifted his head slightly, as if he understood. And just like that, a journey no one believed in began. As David Gower drove back to his ranch with Shadow standing quietly in the trailer, memories he had buried long ago returned like a sudden storm. The road stretched endlessly before him, but his thoughts were trapped in the past. Years ago, David Gower wasn't just a rancher. He was a champion rodeo rider. Crowds cheered his name, and trophies filled his small house. But his greatest supporter was his younger brother, Luke. Luke followed him everywhere, dreaming of becoming a rider just like him. David Gower still remembered the day he convinced Luke to enter his first professional race. "You're ready," David Gower had said with confidence. "Don't let fear stop you." That race changed everything. Luke's horse slipped during a sharp turn. The fall was violent. The crowd's cheers turned into screams. By the time David Gower reached him, Luke was lying motionless on the dirt. He never woke up. Guilt crushed David Gower's heart every single day after that. He blamed himself for pushing Luke to ride. The rodeo world that once gave him life now felt like a graveyard of broken dreams. David Gower quit riding. He sold his trophies. He moved to this quiet ranch, far from crowds and noise. Here, he lived with silence and regret as his only companions. Some nights, he would sit alone on the porch, staring at the stars, whispering apologies to his brother. "I should have protected you," he would say. "I failed you." When David Gower saw Shadow at the rescue shelter, something inside him shattered. The horse had been abandoned, just like Luke's dreams had been buried. Shadow carried pain in his eyes, the same pain David Gower saw in his own reflection. "Maybe we can save each other," David Gower whispered. For the first time in years, David Gower felt a small spark of hope. Maybe helping this broken horse was his chance to forgive himself. Shadow had not always been a broken horse. Once, he had been the pride of a wealthy rancher's stable, strong, swift, and full of spirit. He had raced across fields with effortless grace, winning competitions and admiration. But that life ended the day he stumbled during a championship race. The fall was brutal. Shadow landed awkwardly, one leg twisted, and his confidence shattered along with his body. The owner, impatient and cruel, lost all faith in him. "He's useless now," the man had sneered. "I want him gone." There was no tenderness, no attempt at recovery. Shadow was shoved into a dark stall, fed poorly, and ignored. In the following months, he suffered. Every loud noise startled him. Every touch felt like a threat. He was beaten for flinching, scolded for trembling. Slowly, the once proud horse became wary, hesitant, and fearful of humans. By the time he was rescued, Shadow had learned that trust brought only pain. The shelter volunteers had tried to care for him. They offered soft feed, clean stalls, and gentle voices. But Shadow would flinch at a sudden movement, shy away from hands, and retreat to corners. He had been labeled unreadable by every horse trainer who saw him. "He's too damaged," they said. "No one can ride this horse." Yet, there was still a spark in Shadow's eyes, a quiet, hidden strength. He had survived abuse, neglect, and the cruelty of those who only saw his weakness. Deep down, he yearned for connection, for someone who could see past his scars. When David Gower arrived at the shelter, he didn't see the broken horse everyone else feared. He saw potential, resilience, and the silent courage that Shadow had clung to through every dark day of his life. For the first time in years, Shadow felt a presence he didn't fear. And that presence would change both of their lives forever. The first morning at David Gower's ranch, Shadow was nervous, pacing back and forth in his new stall. Sunlight filtered through the wooden beams, dust motes dancing in the air, but the horse barely noticed. His ears twitched at every sound, and his hooves scraped the floor like a warning. David Gower stood quietly, observing him, careful not to startle the fragile creature. "Easy," he whispered, approaching slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Shadow flinched at the first touch but froze when David Gower continued, gentle and deliberate. Hours passed as David Gower let him nibble on apples from his hand, speaking in calm, measured tones. The horse's tense muscles slowly relaxed. It was a fragile trust, but it was beginning. The first ride was a disaster. David Gower led Shadow to the corral, tightened the saddle, and climbed on with as much care as he could muster. Almost immediately, Shadow bolted, ears pinned back, eyes wide. David Gower fell hard, scraping his shoulder against the dusty ground. The neighbors, watching from the fence line, laughed and shook their heads. "Told you that horse would never ride," one muttered. But David Gower refused to let a single failure define them. Each day, he returned with patience as his weapon. He rode for only a few minutes at a time, then dismounted to walk beside Shadow, letting him regain confidence. He used soft voice commands, gentle pressure with the reins, and treats to reward calm behavior. Progress was slow, agonizingly slow. Shadow stumbled, shied at shadows, and refused certain paths. Yet each small victory a steady walk, a gentle trot felt monumental. At night, David Gower would sit beside him in the quiet barn, brushing his mane and whispering encouragement. "We'll get there," he murmured. "I promise." Even the skeptical neighbors began to notice the change. Shadow's trembling lessened, his eyes held a flicker of curiosity instead of fear, and he followed David Gower's commands without panic. It was clear that, under the rancher's care, the horse was learning to trust again. By the end of the first month, David Gower could ride Shadow around the corral without fear of him bolting. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. And in that fragile progress, both horse and rider found something they hadn't known they still had: hope. For the first time in a long time, David Gower believed that perhaps the world hadn't written Shadow off entirely. And maybe, just maybe, neither had he. Word of David Gower's new companion spread through the town like wildfire. Shadow, the horse everyone had declared useless, had somehow found a home with a quiet rancher. But admiration was scarce, skepticism and whispers ruled. At the general store, ranchers leaned against counters, shaking their heads. "That horse will never last," one said, sipping his coffee. "You're asking for trouble, Carter." Another added, "You're wasting your time. That horse could hurt you or worse." Even the local veterinarian, Dr. Hawthorne, was cautious. He had examined Shadow thoroughly, noting the old injuries and his skittish behavior. "David Gower, I understand your attachment," he said carefully one afternoon. "But he's fragile. One wrong step, one sudden movement, and you could both get seriously hurt. You need to be realistic." David Gower listened quietly, nodding, but he refused to accept the warnings as final. Deep inside, He knew Shadow was more than the sum of his injuries and scars. He had seen glimmers of resilience, moments of courage. He had felt the trust forming between them, and that mattered more than anyone's opinion. Still, doubt crept in during the quiet nights. Alone in the barn, David Gower would sometimes wonder if he had misjudged the horse. What if the townspeople were right? What if Shadow was truly unreadable? Memories of past failure, of his brother's tragic accident, haunted him like a shadow he could not shake. But then he would look into Shadow's eyes, those dark, wary eyes that had endured so much, and he would feel that spark again. That quiet courage that refused to give up. David Gower straightened, running a hand along Shadow's neck. "We'll prove them wrong," he whispered. "No matter what anyone says, we'll keep going." And in that moment, surrounded by the skeptical murmurs of the town, he and Shadow silently made a pact, to face every doubt, every warning, and every obstacle together. It was a stormy evening when everything changed. Dark clouds swallowed the sun, and rain hammered the corrugated roof of the barn. Shadow, usually calm at night, was restless, pacing the stall with frantic energy. The wind howled through the gaps in the wood, and the familiar creak of the barn doors sounded like a threat. Before David Gower could intervene, Shadow bolted, slipping past the partially open gate. David Gower's heart lurched. "Shadow!" he shouted, racing into the downpour. Mud soaked his boots, rain drenched his clothes, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not after all they'd been through. He found Shadow at the far edge of the pasture, near a steep embankment. The horse's legs trembled, his breathing shallow, and panic shone in his eyes. David Gower's chest tightened as he approached slowly, raising his hands and speaking softly. "Easy, boy. It's me. You're safe." Shadow froze, muscles taut, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. But then, David Gower did something he had never done before. He knelt in the mud and let his voice carry across the storm. He spoke not just words, but reassurance, patience, and trust. "I've got you. Don't be afraid. You can do this." Slowly, Shadow stepped toward him. Rain slicked his coat, mud caked his hooves, but he followed David Gower's calm command. One step, then another. When David Gower finally mounted, the horse walked steadily back to the barn without hesitation. For the first time, David Gower realized that Shadow's fear was no longer stronger than his trust. The bond they had built so fragile, so tentative, had become unbreakable. That night, as the storm raged on, David Gower sat beside Shadow in the barn, brushing the wet mane and whispering encouragement. A new determination settled in his chest. They had survived the first real test, and now, he knew they could face whatever the world threw at them. It was a turning point. From this moment on, doubt no longer had a place between them. Weeks passed, and Shadow grew stronger with every ride. David Gower had guided him from a trembling, fearful horse into a creature capable of steady walks and cautious trots. But progress brought attention, and with it, the whispers and challenges from the town. One afternoon, a flyer arrived at David Gower's ranch, soaked from the rain and pinned to the fence by the wind. Bold letters announced the annual County Ranch Ride Challenge, a grueling obstacle course across rocky terrain, mud pits, and shallow rivers. Riders from every neighboring town would compete, their horses swift, strong, and trained for the challenge. David Gower stared at the flyer, the paper trembling in his hand. Shadow nuzzled his shoulder, sensing his unease. The town had already made their opinions clear. "That horse won't last a mile," they had said. "You're risking your neck, Carter." But David Gower saw something different. He saw a chance not for glory, but for redemption. For both of them. That night, David Gower walked through the paddock, rain-slicked grass squelching under his boots. Shadow followed, ears alert, muscles tense but obedient. David Gower spoke softly, kneeling to meet the horse's gaze. "I don't care what anyone says," he murmured. "We can do this. We just need to trust each other. One step at a time." Decision weighed heavily on him. If they failed, it could mean injury or worse. The town would laugh harder than ever, and perhaps Shadow's confidence would crumble. But if they succeeded, it would prove something far greater, that scars do not define strength, and fear does not dictate destiny. By dawn, the choice was made. David Gower led Shadow to the stable, checking the saddle, reins, and every strap with meticulous care. "We'll take it slow," he said, voice steady. One obstacle at a time. No rushing. No shortcuts. Just you and me. Shadow nickered softly in response, as if he understood the challenge ahead. As they rode out of the barn toward the rising sun, David Gower felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The path ahead would be dangerous, and the town's skepticism would follow them like shadows. But for the first time in years, he no longer felt alone. Together, he and Shadow would face the challenge, and whatever happened, they would do it as a team. It was more than a ride. It was a leap of faith. The morning of the County Ranch Ride Challenge dawned crisp and clear, but the tension in the air was palpable. Riders lined up on the dusty trail, muscles taut, eyes focused. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently, nostrils flaring, while the crowd murmured, half expecting disaster. At the very edge stood David Gower, mounted on Shadow, whose coat gleamed despite his scars. Whispers followed them. "That horse won't make it. You're asking for trouble. He'll fall before the first obstacle." The starting horn blared, and riders surged forward. Horses thundered over logs, splashed through mud, and navigated sharp bends with precision. Shadow's legs trembled at first, but David Gower's calm voice guided him. Step by step, they moved in unison. The crowd's murmurs grew into stunned silence. The river crossing loomed ahead. Swift currents crashed against rocks, and horses hesitated. Shadow's ears flicked, fear in his eyes, but David Gower leaned close, whispering encouragement. "You can do this. Trust me." With a deep breath, Shadow stepped into the rushing water, muscles straining but steady, guided entirely by David Gower's voice. The final obstacle approached, a steep, rocky incline with a narrow jump at the top. Riders faltered. Some turned back. David Gower held Shadow steady, feeling his heartbeat sync with his own. "We've got this," he said softly. Shadow bolted upward, powerful despite his past injuries, and leapt. Time seemed to freeze. They landed safely on the other side. Silence hung for a moment, then the crowd erupted in cheers. Riders who had doubted them nodded in awe, children clapped, and even the town skeptics could not hide their astonishment. David Gower's chest swelled with pride not for the victory, but for Shadow. They had faced fear, disbelief, and the odds stacked against them, and together they had triumphed. In that ride, Shadow was no longer the abandoned, broken horse everyone had laughed at. He was a champion, not of speed or strength, but of courage and trust. For David Gower, the lesson was clear. Some victories cannot be measured in medals, they are measured in hearts healed and bonds unbroken. The town slowly began to see Shadow in a new light. Conversations that once carried doubt now carried admiration. People who had laughed and whispered behind fences approached David Gower, offering congratulations and hesitant smiles. The once skeptical veterinarian, Dr. Hawthorne, patted Shadow's neck and said, "I underestimated you both." News of their triumph spread beyond the county, inspiring other ranchers and rescuers. The story of a broken horse and a patient rancher who refused to give up became a symbol of hope, showing that resilience and trust can overcome even the harshest judgments. David Gower continued training Shadow, but the stakes no longer mattered. Each ride was a celebration of their bond, a reminder that healing and courage often come from the most unlikely places. Together, they wandered through fields bathed in golden sunlight, free from doubt, free from fear, and stronger than they had ever been. Shadow was no longer just a horse. He was a testament to the power of unwavering faith. As the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, David Gower rode Shadow to the quiet edge of the ranch. He dismounted and walked to the small, weathered grave of his brother, Luke, placing a hand on the rough stone. The memories of loss and guilt that had haunted him for years pressed against his chest, but today they felt lighter. "I wish you could have seen this, Luke," David Gower whispered. "We did it. Shadow and I. We proved that broken things can still find their strength." Shadow nuzzled David Gower gently, as if understanding the weight of the moment. The horse who had once trembled at every sound now stood tall and proud, a living symbol of perseverance. David Gower took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. A small smile crept across his face. For the first time in years, he felt whole. "Sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones that have been broken," he murmured softly.